Rodney Howe Brandon grew up in a small commune in rural Indiana. The few families who lived there lived off the land. They shared equally and emphasized learning by college educated teachers. Throughout his life, he applied those values and, during his professional careers in social welfare and politics, he passed them on to others in reforms that had a national impact. Rodney Brandon was raised in one of social reformer Robert Owen's Harmonist communities in rural Indiana during the late 1800s. He was under the tutelage of his college educated grandfather and mother. By the age of 14, he had enrolled in Indiana University. By the age of 22, he had embarked on a journalism career in the progressive muckraking tradition popularized during the Theodore Roosevelt era. He was among the first social reformers who recognized the importance of providing for widows and children of workers who had died in high risk jobs in mines and steel mills. In the late 1800s, there was no life insurance or government safety net programs to protect family survivors, only fraternal orders like the Masons and the Elks. He and another organizer propelled the Order of the Moose to international prominence, and then he operated both Mooseheart Child City and the Moose Haven Center for Seniors. Then, at the age of 48, he became the director of Illinois' Department of Public Welfare, serving 12 years under three different governors. All the while, he was motivated to improve the lives of those struggling in poverty and ignorance. He might have led a major national initiative, made a name for himself, even earned a lot of money. Instead, he gave his entire professional life to organize Illinois' child welfare programs and expanding its government welfare services. He did eventually achieve wealth and acclaim, but his successes were achieved not because of his intentions, but despite them. He usually allowed others to claim credit that he deserved. He had a hand in implementing progressive public policies that were initially considered undoable and radical, but they soon came to be standards during his lifetime. Those policies and practices, however beneficial, are still often threatened by conservatism. He championed universal education for the young and women, welfare and social security for working families, vocational training, rehabilitation programs for criminal offenders, prison reform, and entitlement assistance for underprivileged classes, such as the poor, the physically handicapped, the mentally ill, and the elderly. His story begins in territorial Indiana during the early 1800s, where frontier life was primitive. However, the pioneer lifestyle attracted Brandon ancestors. They, and droves of newcomers, sought lives free of the constant constraints that excessive capitalism forced upon them. In industrialized cities, poverty and ignorance were a more likely future than the chance of prosperity and contentment in the frontier. Settlers in the 19th century American Middle West dreamed of a land where new freedoms could allow families to excel to their full potential, unbound by patronage systems that essentially enslaved them. These pioneers actively sought open territories where they could enjoy social freedoms and a chance to better themselves and their progeny in the generations to come. A forerunner in the movement to explore the American frontier and create more humane lives was Scotsman Robert Owen, who lived from 1771 to 1858. Surprisingly, he was a wealthy industrialist whose family made a fortune exploiting workers, including children, in textile mills in Scotland. He saw firsthand the debilitating effects that labor system had on the poor communities. He became a social reformer and a founder of utopian communitarianism, a form of economic socialism within small frontier communities where residents work, earn, and then share all benefits in order to improve their lives and station. It was a radical experiment, but Owen had the money and vision to give the idea legs. In the 1820s, Owen established a town he called New Harmony, Indiana. The community was the first in the U.S. to establish a remarkable assortment of social models, namely America's first kindergarten, the first trade school, free public school, women's clubs, free library, civic dramatic club, and the first geological survey. Although New Harmony was the most accomplished of Owen's communities, there were many other communities that he started, including one called Blue Spring outside Bloomington, Indiana. Just a half-day horse ride southwest of Bloomington, Indiana, was the Harmonist Blue Spring community. One of its founders was Brandon's grandfather, Dudley Chase Smith, who had graduated from the University of Vermont. When he first migrated to Indiana as a young man, he spent 5 years teaching in Bloomington. His first intention may have been to teach, but he was taken by Owen's idea of communitarianism in Indiana. In 1826, Dudley Smith went to New Harmony and met with Robert Owen, who agreed to let Smith to take charge of the Blue Spring community. Later that year, the 28 residents of Blue Spring crafted and signed their Constitution. It emphasized the importance of education. Smith acquired land in the center of the area that came to be called Blue Spring, as indicated by this plat map from 1853. Remarkably, one wooden structure still remains to this day, the church, which also doubled as the school, in which he taught the youth well enough that they could later attend college. Smith lasted the longest of the original 24 incorporators of Harmony. He lived for 83 years, a lot longer than other men of his generation. He married 3 times. His last wife was Elizabeth Porch. They had 5 children, one of whom was Narcissa or Narcy Lee Smith, born in 1842. Dudley is buried at the Hilltop Cemetery near Blue Spring. During the Civil War, in Narcy's early 30s, when the community's sole teacher was fired because she was a Copperhead or Southern sympathizer, Narcy was convinced that she could teach the school children. After all, her father was college educated and taught her well, and she was college educated herself. Galbraith Lynn Brandon, a farmer from west central Illinois, was born in 1839, and in 1865, when he was 26, he volunteered to join 3 of his brothers to fight in the last 6 months of the Civil War. They were part of a successful siege of Vicksburg. After the war, with his military pension in hand, Lynn came to Indiana and joined the Blue Spring community, where he met Narcy and married her. For unknown reasons, they were married in Iowa. Perhaps that's where she attended college. Several colleges have been contacted, but none of them have records of her attending there. In Harmony, life was simple and rudimentary by choice. Rodney lived in a log cabin where he would sleep in the loft. In the winter, the snow would blow onto the blanket of his bed through cracks in the logs. This picture shows a more comfortable clapboard exterior, which was added later. The members of the small community made their own necessities, such as soap from lard, ashes from their fires, and rainwater collected in rain barrels. They produced their own bread, millet, clothing, furniture, and tools. According to Brandon's later recollection, a man worked hard, prayed mightily, and drank his whiskey like a gentleman. If he needed anything, the thought of hitching up and pulling 20 miles through the mud to a pioneer corner store did not appeal to him so much as the thought of going to the blacksmith and carpenter smith and making it himself. Imagine the heightened Owenite influences surrounding young Rodney in Harmony. Through his grandfather and mother, he was taught not only the importance of the education of children and of developing strong character, but also the other ideals of Owen's communitarian life: sharing of property, equality of the sexes, the certainty of scientific fact, learning a trade, etc. These influences set the trajectory of Brandon's life and career. In 1889, 8 years after Rodney was born, the Brandon home in Harmony burned down, and his parents moved their family to nearby Bloomington. Narcy and Lynn bought a boarding house along the southern edge of Indiana University. Rodney attended elementary and high school. He read voraciously, so much so that he wore glasses for the rest of his life, according to a daughter. He told a story on himself about cleverly identifying passers-by on the street, not by sight, but by the clip-clop of their horse. In 1895, the same year that Brandon's father, Lynn, died, he enrolled in Indiana University at age 14. Rodney took his time with college. He started in 1895, but did not leave until 6 years later, in 1901, when he was 20. When he was a sophomore, he had already been editor for several years of the Daily Student. It became a daily paper during his tenure. Brandon pledged to Beta Theta Pi fraternity, which has long been one of the leading fraternities on campus. Quote, "The fraternity brotherhood is based on the three core values: mutual assistance, cultivation of the intellect, and unfaltering fidelity." Those sound like principles he had grown up following. After graduation and a 3-year stint working for AT&T in New York City, Brandon decided to try making a career of journalism. He found a post with a newspaper in Anderson, Indiana, 90 miles northeast of Bloomington. Anderson rose in economic prominence starting in 1887 when natural gas was discovered underground. By 1900, its population was 20,000 people, twice the size of a decade earlier. The major newspaper in Anderson was the Herald, which, according to its own account, already ranked high in the newspaper field and was, quote, placed in the forefront of Indiana newspapers. Brandon was, in turn, a reporter, editor, and makeup man for the paper. Evidence of Brandon's specific work at the paper is difficult to determine. Editors were not even listed in the paper's masthead. About the same time, 1906, he also authored Who is Who in Anderson, a collection of biographies and illustrations of successful men in Anderson. In an unusual self-promoting stroke, Brandon included himself. The book was a frothy promotion of the personalities in Anderson, much like a Chamber of Commerce piece intended to lure company leaders to the town. In the years between 1903 and 1912, the years that Brandon lived in Anderson, E.C. Toner played an important role in not only prominence of the Herald newspaper, but also the re-establishment of Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party prior to the presidential election of 1912. It is tempting to speculate that when Brandon considered a career move to journalism, he was thinking of not just working for a good newspaper, but also positioning himself as a springboard for broader social programs and politics. Several years after Brandon's arrival in Anderson in 1907, when he was 26, he met a charismatic and persuasive young man named Jim Davis. He was the recorder of Madison County, Indiana, where Anderson was the county seat. Davis learned of the Loyal Order of the Moose when it was a fledgling fraternal club. Fraternal organizations like the Masons and Oddfellows were not only social associations for men of similar backgrounds, they provided, in many cases, the only welfare safety net for laborers in high-risk jobs, like steelworkers or coal miners, who made up the largest groups within the Moose Order. Prior to this time, when laborers had a debilitating accident and could no longer work, they and their families were left destitute. Companies never provided insurance or benefits to families. The children would often end up in orphanages, which were poorly run. This was long before nonprofit organizations or governments recognized their key responsibilities that they could have in addressing these social problems. But the benefits that fraternal orders provided to workers were meager. Since the annual memberships were only a few dollars, the common funds and disability payouts were similarly paltry. In the fall of 1906, the order had only 3 lodges remaining and a membership of 100 men. It was on the verge of collapse. But James Davis saw the vast potential that if the order could increase its membership by orders of magnitude, individual members could receive a meaningful safety net for their families. This is one major indicator of Davis's genius, his foresight. He could see the potential. At the 1906 Moose National Convention, with only 7 delegates in attendance, Davis gave a rousing address. He was appointed supreme organizer of the order. He and a group of traveling colleagues set out to recruit Moose members and establish lodges throughout the U.S. and Canada. After a Herculean effort of whistle-stop tours with stump speeches, he was enormously effective, growing the order to nearly 500,000 members and 1,000 lodges by 1912. They had significantly built up the Moose chapter and coffers. This achievement marked Davis's second indicator of genius. He was a superb promoter. Davis and Brandon had shared beliefs, as expressed in part through their affiliation with Theodore Roosevelt's New Progressivist wing of the Republican Party. The two men shared an enthusiasm for social welfare for the working class, but not via government, rather through pooled private resources such as fraternalism. Back in 1907, Brandon had resigned from the Anderson Herald to become editor of the Moose Order's newsletter, Call of the Moose. The Order's national headquarters were moved to Anderson. In 1909, Rodney married Harriet Lane, an organist and choir director at the First Presbyterian Church in Anderson. She had studied organ at the Cincinnati Conservatory. She was 33 and he was 28. It's possible that Rodney met Harriet through their shared appreciation in music. Back at Indiana University, Rodney had impressed fellow students that decades later, one of them wrote about his talents in both songwriting and singing. At the 1911 Order Convention in Detroit, Davis, who was now Director General, recommended that the Order acquire property for an institute, school, or college that would provide a home, school, and vocational training classes for the orphans of Order members. For months, offers came, and several meetings were held regarding the project. In 1912, the leaders of the Order decided to purchase the 750-acre Brookline Farm, a dairy farm near Batavia, Illinois. It was close to the Fox River, 2 railway lines, and the all-dirt Lincoln Highway. The name Mooseheart had been adopted for the center. It was dedicated in the summer of 1913. In the 1913 issue of Call of the Moose, announcing the selection of the site, Trustee E.J. Henning announced, "Someone must be found big enough, wise enough, charitable enough, and humane enough to take charge of building so great an enterprise." At the Order's next national convention, the fraternity identified that man, Rodney Brandon. Brandon moved his young family from Anderson to the Mooseheart property in Illinois. They lived in the Mooseheart farmhouse for several years. With applications from families now coming in steadily, the student population swelled from 11 to more than 50 during the 1913 school year. Brandon had to direct the construction of a brand new village from scratch, while somehow simultaneously enrolling, housing, feeding, and schooling the children. From 1907 until 1913, Brandon was the Mooseheart's executive director, as well as the first corporate secretary of the Moose Order, called the Supreme Secretary, essentially serving as its first CEO-COO, keeping all the records straight and paying all the bills. By 1918, the 5th anniversary of Mooseheart, the acreage resembled a new suburban neighborhood with a network of water and sewer lines, steam tunnels for heat, and electric lines all over the new campus, along with paved concrete roads and fireproof concrete block residences. Brandon spread the principles upon which Mooseheart had been built. In 1919, he was a delegate to the Illinois Constitutional Convention and chair of the Committee on Education. Mooseheart's innovative program of mixing academics with vocational training for older students was beginning to be emulated in schools across the nation, including a brand new Nebraska institution, which would soon be nicknamed Boys Town. The year before, its founder, Father Edward Flanagan, had visited Mooseheart with keen interest. In addition to Mooseheart, in 1922, the order fulfilled a vision of Brandon's by establishing a new retirement center they called Moose Haven. It is still located in Orange Park, Florida, just outside Jacksonville, on the northeastern coast. This project had 26 acres of property and 22 retired Moose residents. While Mooseheart began as a school, it soon became a small incorporated village and hub of the Moose organization. Although the Mooseheart campus was built to accommodate a maximum population of 500, its numbers would grow to 1,000 by 1920, reaching a peak of 1,300 during the Great Depression, and finally returning to its normal capacity of 500, where it remains to this day. In 1924, Brandon moved the family to a Greek Revival-style home just north of Mooseheart on the Lincoln Highway, or Route 31, along the Fox River. The home was then owned by Mooseheart, but had been built by Judge Samuel D. Lockwood, who served as Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. In 1928, after a span of 21 years with Mooseheart and the Order, Brandon retired at the age of 47. But he was only moving between careers in a related field. Ever since Brandon's involvement with Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party back in 1912 in Indiana, Brandon felt a call to public service. Now in his 40s, with decades of applied experience operating fraternal social programs, work-study schools for and retirement facilities for seniors, he felt equipped to tackle policy setting at the state and federal level. First, he did his research and tested his theories among world experts. In 1926, he went to Europe as an investigator for the U.S. government. He was to exchange policies and methods for the care of dependent children and aged persons. Brandon believed that the English and German systems were the most outstanding examples of what governments might do. 2 years later, he was named American delegate to the Pan-American Welfare Congress meeting in Havana, Cuba. Within a year, in 1929, Brandon became Illinois Director of Public Welfare under the newly elected Republican governor, Lewis Lincoln Emerson. 10 years earlier, Illinois had been the first state to establish a Department of Public Welfare. The department included a daunting number of responsibilities, including the state's penitentiaries and correctional institutions for women and children, child welfare, veteran services, the adult blind, public assistance, delinquency prevention, criminal identification and investigation, and the training schools for boys and girls. In 1930, early in Brandon's administration, he authored an official document he titled Correction in Illinois. It was just 6 typewritten pages, but it clearly expressed his progressive views. The Scopes trial lawyer, Clarence Darrow, read the document and praised Brandon's analysis of the causes of crime in the United States as, quote, the most common sense plan he had seen for correcting criminality in youth. America had witnessed the crash of Wall Street in 1929, which led to the worst economic depression in the history of the industrialized world. It would last for 10 years, but by 1933, it had reached its lowest point. Some 15 million Americans were unemployed, and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. It may have appeared to many social reformers like Brandon that to save America from the brink of complete collapse, emergency measures were called for. During this period, Brandon was in his mid-50s, arguably at the peak of his professional career. By 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president. Policy leaders were desperate to explain what had happened, and more importantly, how America could climb out of the crisis. Rodney Brandon penned an essay called 13 Horsemen, citing the many problems that society was facing. However, when Brandon got around to proposing solutions, he fell short. The final 2 pages of the manuscript describe not solutions, but constructive possibilities. For several institutions, such as state hospitals for the insane and mental institutions, he recommended raising the clinical authority of mid-level attending professionals so they could assist the load carried by physicians, psychiatrists, and nurses. He said that the salaries for these mid-level professionals should be raised to make their careers more attractive. His penchant for Owenite communitarian ideals became evident in one of his concluding sentences. The community will become less of an institution and more like a village. His manuscript ended abruptly. Perhaps he was too busy implementing his programs, or maybe the state was unable or unwilling to come up with the funds to pay for it. Also likely, FDR's own policy experts in the Democratic Party, federally, were busy developing their own massive social programs. Rodney ran as a Republican candidate for congressman at large, but the Democrats swept the national election, with FDR at the top of the Republican slate. Brandon's Illinois district fell to the Democrats as well. It is an ironic twist in political history that the Democrats under FDR usurped the Republican Party's platform of liberal progressive social reforms. Many of the positions that Republicans like Brandon stood for were eclipsed by the Democrats, fueled by the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. But Brandon probably took solace in knowing that his progressive social reforms were being implemented on a federal scale under FDR's leadership. However, his orientation and Roosevelt's aligned in that the best arena for implementation of social programs would be at the community level, using pre-existing state and municipal programs in better touch with their constituents. During the nearly 4 terms of FDR's New Deal presidency, America saw the institution of some of the world's most progressive social welfare programs. Never had America's underprivileged classes, workers, farmers, older adults, children, handicapped, and the blind, enjoyed such rights and entitlements. Brandon witnessed the rise of family security, which effectively eliminated much of the urgency experienced by surviving wives and orphan children. They were now guaranteed protection under federal programs. By 1941, several years after the end of the Great Depression and on the verge of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II, Brandon had regained his political strength. By that time, he had been directing public welfare for 12 years and serving under his third governor in Illinois. Brandon's personal ventures reflected his progressive ideals and determination to help others. While his moose related endeavors brought limited income, Brandon invested in entrepreneurial ventures with his friend Ernest Emo Oswald. Together, they explored oil, canning, telephones, and peony farming, though most were unsuccessful. Harriet encouraged Brandon to pursue financial independence to enhance his ability to help others. Their breakthrough came with Campana Corporation in 1926. Brandon and Oswald co-founded the company, turning Italian balm into North America's top-selling lotion, marketed through radio programs that launched the careers of actors like Don Amici and Tyrone Power. By 1937, Campana's state-of-the-art Bauhaus Art Deco headquarters in Batavia, Illinois, reflected their innovation. Employees enjoyed modern amenities, including air conditioning, a cafeteria, and medical benefits, showcasing Brandon's progressive approach to business and community welfare. In 1929, after 21 years in politics, Brandon retired from political service. He was 68 years old. Nearly 20 years later, he died on March 16, 1968, at the age of 86. At that time, he was the oldest member of the Moose in years of membership. There is a point at which most storytellers and historians run out of documentation and must connect the dots between the clear facts and mere supposition. Since Brandon disdained credit for his accomplishments, one tribute claimed that he was, quote, obviously void of pretense. It is difficult to document his talents and the influences he may have had on others. He was an exceptional writer and communicator. He had been editor of the Anderson Herald, editor of the Call of the Moose, and author of several tracts and books about public welfare. However, in his self-effacing manner, he left a severe shortage of his own candid opinions. Nevertheless, Brandon's legacy was full of progressive thought and programs. That humanitarian trail in Brandon's life led from Harmony, Indiana, to Anderson, to Mooseheart, and the Illinois Department of Public Welfare.